Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Canberra Community Law and Women's Legal Centre CLE on working or not working, as the case may be, during COVID-19. I'm Sophie from Canberra Community Law, and this is Beth, an employment and discrimination lawyer from the Women's Legal Centre. Hopefully you can see us both. We'll each do part of the presentation and then answer your questions. We're coming to you from Canberra, Ngunnawal land, and we'd like to acknowledge the elders past, present and emerging. We pay our respects to the traditional owners of this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Beth and I wanted to host this session because we've been getting lots of questions from the community about JobSeeker, JobKeeper, and what supports are available for people during the pandemic. So you might have been stood down or lost your job or have lost shifts due to the closures of venues and restrictions on gatherings in public places. Or maybe you're a sole trader and you've seen a downturn in your business income. For a lot of people, it's been really confusing with all of the government announcements about what schemes you can access, whether you should be going to Centrelink or going to the ATO. So we're going to try and help you navigate that and talk through it this evening. So the way that this is going to work is that I'm a social security and tenancy lawyer. So I'll talk about the JobSeeker payment and the Centrelink side of things. And Beth is an employment lawyer, so she will cover the JobKeeper side of things and your rights at work. So this session is about legal information, not specific legal advice. So please post your questions in the comments, but if possible, keep them general about the schemes, about what you might be able to access, not your specific legal inquiries. At the end, we'll pop up a slide that shows you how you can get in touch with us at our legal services if you do need a one-on-one appointment. So I will hand over to you now, Beth, to tell us a little bit about what the JobKeeper payment is.
Great, thanks very much, Sophie, and hello to everyone tuning in. It's very, very cold and wet here in Canberra, so hopefully you're all rugged up nice and warm. So JobKeeper. The JobKeeper payment is a payment administered by the Australian Taxation Office and paid to businesses that have suffered a substantial decline in turnover to help them retain their employees. So some not-for-profits, partnerships, self-employed individuals and sole traders are also eligible for the payment. Eligible businesses can choose to participate, to opt into the scheme and receive $1,500 per fortnight to pass on to each eligible employee. As an employee, you do not apply for this payment. It's something your employer applies for and passes on to you. And they must pass on the full $1,500 less tax. Your employer may ask you to sign a nomination form. And if you have multiple employers, you can only nominate with one employer. So once a business opts in, all of its eligible employees must receive the payment. The employer cannot pick and choose which employees to give it to. Now, the JobKeeper scheme does make some major changes to your rights at work. Employers are able to make some directions and requests of you that they wouldn't normally be able to. For example, reducing your hours or changing your duties or your place of work. However, it doesn't mean your employer can get away with paying you less than they normally would for the same amount of work. That's a very quick summary of JobKeeper. How about JobSeeker, Sophie?
Great. Thanks, Beth. So confusingly, I think at least the government chose to name these schemes that are very different. They chose to name them very similar rhyming names. But the JobSeeker payment is an entirely different scheme. So it is something that you can apply for as an individual. And it's a Centrelink payment. It's a social security payment. So it's administered through Centrelink, not through the ATO. And it has very different eligibility criteria to the JobKeeper payment that Bethany just went through. So in a nutshell, JobSeeker is the updated version of the old New Start allowance. So it's a social security payment that's administered through Centrelink. It's income tested. So how much JobSeeker payment you get is determined by how much money you earn and how much money your partner earns. And from that, Centrelink works out how much money they're going to give you every fortnight. You apply for it through Centrelink, so through your MyGov account, and then you report to Centrelink every fortnight your income in order to keep receiving it. You have to report any changes in your income, any increases or decreases, so that they can continue to work out how much to pay you. And there are mutual obligations attached to you receiving it. So you have to do certain things in order to receive that JobSeeker payment. So that's it in a nutshell. JobSeeker is the Centrelink payment. It's income tested and it has mutual obligations attached to it. JobKeeper, as Beth said, is a scheme administered by the ATO that an employer or a business can access to keep their staff on the books. So what we'll do now is, that's just like brief nutshell overview, so you know what we're talking about. Now Beth is going to talk about the JobKeeper scheme in a bit more detail, and she's going to let you know what your rights are if your boss does decide to access that scheme, and what sort of changes the JobKeeper scheme might mean for you. And then I'll talk a bit more about JobSeeker, and then we'll take your questions and go from there. So Beth, do you want to give us the rundown on JobKeeper? You are muted, Beth.
Sorry, classic Zoom mistake. So there is a lot of detail in the new JobKeeper scheme, which businesses, workers, accountants, and us lawyers are all trying to get our heads around. So I'll go through as much as I can in the time we've got. So which businesses are eligible for the scheme? So most businesses will have to show a 30% decline in turnover, but this is 50% for larger businesses with more than 1 billion in turnover and 15% for charities. This is generally calculated on the same period last year. If you're a sole trader, you need to have had or expect a 30% decline in turnover too. You also need to have had an ABN as at the 12th of March and meet some additional rules about reporting to the ATO. So which employees are eligible? So all full-time, part-time employees and long-term casuals. So what is a long-term casual? It's a casual worker who has worked for the business for at least 12 months by the 1st of March on a regular and systematic basis. And that could just be a few hours each week as long as it's regular. It also includes employees who have been stood down and includes employees who were made redundant after the 1st of March but have since been re-employed. You must be at least 16 years of age by the 1st of March, but if you're a full-time student and not financially independent, you must be at least 18. You must also either be an Australian citizen, a permanent visa holder, a protected special category visa holder, or you can be a holder of a subclass 444 special category visa if you're also a resident for tax purposes. So there's a couple of a few complicated ones in there. You must not be receiving government parental leave pay, dad and partner pay, or payment under workers' compensation for total incapacity. So it's okay if you're receiving workers' compensation and working, but if you're off work completely, then you're not eligible. You also cannot be a recipient of a JobKeeper payment from another employer. As I mentioned before, you have to nominate which employer you're going to receive it from. So how much should you receive? Your employer has to pass on the full $1,500 less tax to you, even if you usually earn less than this in the fortnight, and even if you've been stood down without pay. If you usually earn more than $1,500 per fortnight and you're still working your usual hours, your employer has to pay you your full wages. They just use the $1,500 to subsidise this. And you should also be paid super as you normally would. So if you usually receive less than $1,500, your employer only has to pay super on your normal wage, not the whole $1,500 they're required to pay you just because of the JobKeeper. Now, the changes to the Fair Work Act do mean that if you do qualify for JobKeeper, your employer can give you 3 new kinds of directions. So the first one is they can give you a stand down direction. So that could be to stand you down completely. It could be that you are directed to work for a lesser period on a day or reduce your number of hours overall. But this can only happen if you can't be employed as usual because of COVID-19 or because of the government initiatives to slow the transmission. So they have to prove that connection with COVID-19. They can also direct you to perform other duties. So this wouldn't normally be allowed, but if you're on JobKeeper, this is something your employer can now do. But you have to have the relevant skills and competency to be able to do them, the relevant license. They can't expect you to do something that you're not qualified to do. And it must be reasonable. It must be within the scope of that, your employer's business operations, so not something completely different. They can also direct you to work at a different place, but only if it's necessary to continue the employment of one or more employees. So if that place, it could be your home. If it's not, they can't require you to travel an unreasonable distance. So all these new directions, they have to be reasonable. They must be safe, including having regard to the nature and spread of COVID-19. And your employer must consult with you first. So your employer has to give you written notice at least 3 days before the direction comes into force. It can be a lesser period if you genuinely agree to a lesser period of notice. Important point on these directions is that if you are on a JobKeeper enabling direction, your leave continues to accrue as though that direction wasn't in place. So you would accrue leave like you normally do. And in the same way, redundancy pay and payment in lieu of notice of termination, so payment you get if your employment is terminated, is calculated as if the direction wasn't given as well. There's also new JobKeeper enabling agreements. So these are requests that both you and your employer can make of each other. And if your employer does make one of these requests, you cannot unreasonably refuse. So for example, your employer could request that you work on days or times that are different to your normal days or times of work, but they can't reduce your hours of work. They could also request that you take annual leave. And this is one we get lots of questions about at the moment. It is, they are able to request it as long as you're not left with fewer than 2 weeks annual leave. So they can't whittle down your leave balance to less than 2 weeks. You can also agree to take twice as long at half pay. And under these new provisions, you can also make a request of your employer. You can request that you be allowed to take on a second job, particularly if they've stood you down partially or fully. You can also request to undergo training or professional development, and your employer must consider your request and not unreasonably refuse your request. So in all of that, I've said the words reasonable and unreasonable a lot. So there's bound to be disputes about what is reasonable and what's unreasonable. And unfortunately, we've already seen these disputes starting to happen between employees and employers. The good news is that the Fair Work Commission is now set up to take applications to deal with these types of disputes. So if your employer has issued you with a direction or you've refused a request and you're arguing over the reasonableness of that direction or your refusal, you can apply to the Fair Work Commission to deal with that dispute. So it could be about the location of your hours, the number of hours, the change in your duties, request to take annual leave, all those types of things that I had just discussed, but they can't deal with disputes about whether or not an employer or an employee is eligible for the JobKeeper scheme. So if you do have a dispute with your employer, you can apply to the Fair Work Commission online using a new form. It's Form F13A. There's no application fee, so it's free, and you don't have to have a lawyer to go through that process. Finally, the payments, when will they start? So your employer can be reimbursed for payments made from 30th of March, but they'll have to prove that they actually made these payments to you. They can't wait for the payments to come through to the government and then pass them on to you. But businesses should start to get the payments fairly soon, hopefully in the next week. Now, all of these changes will automatically cease on the 28th of September 2020. So that means if your employer has given you a direction that is not allowed under just under the JobKeeper scheme, this direction will stop on the 28th of September. So for example, if you've been directed to change your working days and times, things should go back to normal in 6 months' time. So the questions we've got on. Facebook?
We've got a few. Do you want me to throw a couple to you, Beth?
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
So we've got a question here from Sarah. Sarah's working for a small company which has seen a big loss in sales due to COVID-19. She's on the JobKeeper scheme. So her boss has signed up to JobKeeper. She's working full-time from home and she's getting $1,500 per fortnight. But her normal fortnightly salary is more than that $1,500. Now, Sarah's understanding was that the employer pays the difference, but Sarah's employer doesn't think that's correct. Can you clarify that?
Yeah, absolutely. So your employer, if you're working your normal number of hours, your employer should be paying you as they normally would. The JobKeeper payment is a subsidy, so it goes to the employer to pay to help them pay you your normal wages. So you should be getting paid as you normally were if you're working your normal hours. There has been a lot in the media about certain companies asking all of their employees to take pay cuts at the moment. And while that is always available to employers to ask their employees to take pay cuts, you don't have to agree to that. You don't have to agree to that change in your employment contract. And you absolutely should be paid the minimum wage. So looking at if you're covered by an award or an enterprise agreement, what your minimum wages are. So certainly encourage you to try and get some legal advice. And as Sophie mentioned, we'll have all the details of who you can contact at the end of this presentation.
And thanks, Beth, I think that answered Sarah's question. She's also said, though, that her employer is under the impression that they can just keep paying the $1,500 until their sales come back up to normal. Sounds like from what you've said, that's not correct. Can you just confirm that?
Yes, absolutely. That's right. So you have to be paid for the work you're doing. It would be different if they had lost so much business that they had stood you down and you were no longer working your normal hours. But if the question is, if I'm working my normal hours, what should I get paid? You should absolutely get paid. If you normally get paid more than 1,500, you should be getting paid that higher amount.
Yeah, great. And if someone does need to go through the Fair Work process, Anna's just asked here, how long does that? So you said you can just file a form online. What happens then?
So it's a very new process, so we don't know yet exactly how it's going to work. I imagine the Fair Work Commission is going to prioritise these types of applications. So with the usual kinds of applications that you submit to the Fair Work Commission, like an unfair dismissal application, usually what would happen once it's lodged is that the employer would file a response, and it could be set down for a telephone conciliation conference, which is still happening at the moment via Skype and all sorts of other ways. So, and normally that should be within a few weeks, hopefully. But I think there's a huge increase in these disputes, unfortunately, at the moment. So it might be a bit more of a delay than that.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And I've just got two more quick ones before we move on. One of them is from Brittany. So she's asked that if a casual employee is receiving the JobKeeper payments, is there any incentive for them to accept and work their rostered shifts? So she said, particularly if taking the shifts would mean they still earn under $1,500 before tax. Sounds like there's a bit of confusion there.
Yeah. So if you, for example, work 5 hours a week and you earn less than $1,500 in a fortnight, you still get the whole JobKeeper payment. And it would be reasonable for your employer to ask you to work your normal hours. So I don't think you could refuse to work if there's work available. But absolutely. So you should either get $1,500 at minimum, or if you normally earn more than that and you're doing your normal hours more than that, you shouldn't be getting less.
So I think this is the bit of confusion, if I'm interpreting Brittany's question right, I know that some folks have been getting confused about whether you get the JobKeeper payment irrespective of whether or not you're working. Can you just confirm, if there is work for you to do, do you need to do that work in order to receive the JobKeeper payment?
Right, thanks, Sophie. So yes, you can't, if there's work available and your employer is offering you work, you can't refuse to go to work. It's your employer's decision whether or not you're being stood down or whether there's work available.
Great. Okay, last question is, if someone is on the JobKeeper payment, can they have another job and can they be looking for other work?
It will depend on your employment contract, whether or not you are able to take on a secondary job, just as it would in any other situation. So some employment contracts would prevent you from taking on another job, particularly in those kinds of industries where you might, your employer might not want you to go to work for a competitor. But under the new JobSeeker scheme, you can make a request under that to take on a second job, and your employer must not unreasonably refuse that. So if you've been stood down and you request to take on some alternative work, you know, I think it would be reasonable for them to agree to that, unless it's going to be, you know, damaging to the business, or unless they actually need you to work full time for them, those kinds of situations.
Okay, I think that's everyone for now. Thanks so much, Beth. I might now just run through the JobSeeker payment, so the Centrelink side of things for people that don't have access to JobKeeper, and then we will answer any questions that pop up about that, and then we'll see where we're at. So Beth has just talked through what can happen if your employer accesses the JobKeeper scheme, but what happens if that's not what your employer does? So there is still support available to you, even if your employer isn't eligible for JobKeeper or you're not put on that scheme for some reason. And one option that's available is the JobSeeker allowance. So this is the primary unemployment payment that now exists through Centrelink. It's replacing the old New Start allowance that you probably all heard about. So to get the JobSeeker allowance, you need to be between 22 years old and 66, 66 being the age that you can get the age pension. And if you're under 22, but you're unemployed and looking for work, then you may be eligible for what's called the youth allowance JobSeeker. And if you can't work because you're looking after very, very young children, you might be eligible for a parenting payment. So those are the payments that are sort of available to you. The JobSeeker payment, it's a payment that changes according to your income. So it decreases relative to the amount of income that you bring in. And what this means is that you can actually still be employed and working and receiving it so long as you're earning below a certain threshold. So for example, maybe you've been working full-time at a cafe, but because of COVID-19, you've had your shifts cut. So you're still employed, you're still working, but you're only working, one day a week. You may now earn below that threshold that the JobSeeker payment is at. And so you can also receive the JobSeeker payment to supplement your income. The other thing that the JobSeeker payment is impacted by is your income, obviously, but also your partner's income. So if you have a partner, you'll also need to let Centrelink know how much money they're bringing in. So we can post the link in the chat, but if you go to the Centrelink website, there's a section that's called JobSeeker payment, how much you can get. And there are a bunch of really simple, easy to read tables that set out, what the income test is for you, what your partner's income can be, and then the different rates of pay that are available to you depending on whether you have kids that you're looking after, whether you're single, and those different scenarios. So just to make it super clear, to get the JobSeeker payment, you need to be an Australian citizen or resident between 22 and 66, unemployed or looking for work, or sick or injured, but not with a permanent disability. That's a different payment, but sick or injured and so can't work for a period of time. If you meet this criteria, then you should apply for the JobSeeker payment online, and you will receive whatever the entitlement is based on your income, plus something that's called the coronavirus supplement, which is an extra $550 per fortnight. So it's effectively the old New Start payment plus this extra amount of money. Now that coronavirus supplement isn't forever. It's for a 6-month period, so it expires towards the end of this year. And it's basically a boost in recognition that the times are harder because of the coronavirus. So the one other thing that I should mention in terms of eligibility is that you can actually access the JobSeeker payment if you're a sole trader. That can be a little bit confusing because as a sole trader, sometimes you can also access the JobKeeper payment, which is what Beth was talking about. And that's because as a sole trader, you're kind of like your own employer. And so you get treated, you're eligible for both schemes. So I won't go through that in detail unless some people ask some questions about it in the comments, in which case I will. But I think it's only a small number of people that probably fall into that category. So the final thing is I did say that this Centrelink payment, it's income dependent, but it also attracts its own obligations. So unlike the JobKeeper payment, which is a wage supplement that you're getting through your boss, a JobSeeker payment is a social security payment from the government that's given to you if you demonstrate that you're looking for work. So it's an unemployment benefit. And so it has these obligations to do certain things through job service providers. And that could be looking for jobs or performing certain tasks. Now, at the moment, those mutual obligations have been suspended, but so far they're only suspended until the 22nd of May 2020. It's really important that if you access the JobSeeker payment, you understand that you probably will have to fulfill those mutual obligations at some point. And if you don't, you can be cut off your Centrelink payments. So 2 practical things. How do you apply? You have a couple of options. You can put in your claim online, or you can do it over the phone, or you can go physically to the Centrelink office. To apply online, which is probably the easiest way, and it's certainly the way that Centrelink has been recommending for public health reasons as much as anything else. And also we've all heard horror stories about how long people are waiting on phone lines. So if you can do it online, that's probably best, but you will need to have a MyGov account set up. And you need to link that to either Medicare or the ATO website. So that means having a tax file number or a Medicare card, and you'll need a Centrelink reference number. Now, if you've ever been on Centrelink before, you will have one of those. It's a 9-digit number with a letter on the end, and you can find it on Centrelink paperwork or sometimes on concession cards, and you can just log into MyGov and then complete. There's a kind of like an expression of interest that you can plug in, and then Centrelink will call you and complete your claim, or you can do the whole thing online. But if you don't have that CRN number, then you can also call Centrelink and do it that way. So if you do this, we have heard from some people that when they've applied online, it's taken a while for Centrelink to confirm their payment. And this is because Centrelink is facing, more applications of this nature than they've had in the past. But one thing that you should bear in mind is that definitely don't hold back on applying, because the sooner you apply, Centrelink, if you are found to be eligible, they will backdate your payments to that point in time. So while it might take them a little while to process your payment and start those payments coming, they will backdate it to the point that you apply. So if you haven't applied yet, you think you might be eligible, then definitely apply now. And that way you can get your payments backdated to this point in time. So that is JobSeeker in a nutshell. The one other thing I'll just add is I know that some people are in the situation where they think maybe their work will be trying to access the JobKeeper scheme, but they haven't been told yet whether or not they will be receiving that side of things. And I'd really encourage you to consider applying for the JobSeeker payment in the meantime. Basically, there's no guarantees, as Beth said, nothing forces an employer or a business to sign up to the JobKeeper scheme. So if you're not sure that that is something that you're going to be getting, then applying for the JobSeeker payment at least means you'll get some Centrelink income and you'll be able to get by until it becomes clear whether or not your employer is going to keep you on and pay you by that other method. The one thing to remember if you do decide to do that is you have a legal obligation when you receive Centrelink payments to report to them your income and your changes of circumstance. So if you are on the JobSeeker payment and then your employer puts you on the JobKeeper payment, you need to let Centrelink know straight away. Technically, you can stay on both schemes, but your JobSeeker payment, if you're getting $1,500 a fortnight, that'll be reduced down to nothing. So you may want to just hop off that scheme at that point. But either way, the most important thing is that you always report any change in your circumstances and income, because otherwise you might end up with a debt to Centrelink. So I think that is everything on JobSeeker. Did any questions pop up about JobSeeker? I can't see any.
Most recent one.
Mm-hmm.
The rest look like JobKeeper questions.
Do we have any feedback on how severe the waiting times are on the Centrelink phones at the moment? I mean, it's one of those difficult things because obviously no one calls you to tell you that they've got through really quickly. So there might be a bit of confirmation bias, but certainly what we're hearing is that people are waiting for a really long period of time. And also that sometimes the line drops out, and even when Centrelink calls you back, in which case they probably won't call you again. So you're going to need to pick up the phone and try again. So yeah, I think it is really frustrating for people, but my advice is to do what you can online and then to persevere with the phone line. One thing that's helped people apply online, because there've also been problems with too much traffic, is that I've heard some folks have had success applying really late at night when other people aren't using the website. So that might be something to consider as well. Anna's also asked whether you can get JobSeeker if you have savings. So you can. They've changed the assets test for JobSeeker to expand the pool of people who are eligible. So if you go onto the Centrelink website, we'll post a link. It shows the conditions for applying for the JobSeeker payment. And in fact, as soon as we finish chatting here, I'll post the link to your comment so you can have a look there. And one more from Grace. So Grace is under 22. She was stood down due to COVID. She's seeking work and applying for the Centrelink JobSeeker Youth Allowance. Is Centrelink still looking at dependency and parental income? If so, can I still get a payment if I am determined as dependent? That is a really good question, Grace. And you've got a few of your personal details in there. So let me post after this, a link to the information for you. And then if that doesn't answer your question, I'll put our phone and email contacts there so you can get in touch with us because there are some specific, there are some specific things about dependency. You're right. Okay. Beth, if you're happy, I might just pull out another couple of these leftover ones.
Sure.
So let me have a little look here. We've got a question from Mim. So if you have been stood down, are you still able to accrue annual leave, and at what rate do you accrue it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So all of your leave and periods of service should accrue like they normally do, as though you had not been given a direction. So if you're on JobKeeper and you've been stood down, you still accrue your annual leave like you would have done last year before all of this happened.
Yeah, great. Okay, that's super clear. What about other entitlements? So Ira has asked whether employers have to pay for workers' comp and superannuation on top of JobKeeper. And she specifically asked, do they have to do that if it means that the business will go under? So if the business is in financial hardship, I guess.
So yes, employers do still have to pay superannuation. But if you normally earn less than $1,500, they only have to pay the super on the lesser amount. With workers' compensation, as I said before, if you're receiving workers' compensation for total incapacity, you're not working at all, then you're not eligible for JobKeeper. But yes, your employer doesn't get out of paying for workers' compensation. I guess the second part of that question is really a cash flow problem, and it is a real problem for a lot of small businesses at the moment, particularly paying staff before the JobKeeper payments start coming through. There are the banks are trying to do their best to offer loans for businesses in that situation to tie them over during that period. But yeah, absolutely. You just because businesses are doing it tough doesn't mean that they can get out of their obligations as employers.
Yeah, great. Okay.
I did also notice a question from Anna about can you force your employer to apply for JobKeeper, which is one we've got a few times. So no, you can't force your employer to opt into the scheme, but if your employer has opted in, they have to apply for all eligible employees. They can't pick and choose between employees. If you think that your employer should be opting in, it's something you could raise with the tax office, but it really is, it's an opt-in choice. So it is the employer's choice whether they do it. So I guess encouraging them, providing them with information if they're not willing to, having a discussion about why they're not. And a lot of these things, it's about having a negotiation and discussion with your employer about what's going to work best for both of you.
And I guess maybe a question, Beth, that's relevant there is in that pre phase when the employer is deciding whether or not to opt in. What happens if the employer says things to you like, we will only opt in if you take more hours, things like that? Are they allowed to put those sorts of conditions on their employees?
No. So that they cannot put conditions on you for you to be able to receive the JobKeeper payment. You're either eligible or not. So if you meet the eligibility requirements that I went through before, you should be getting it. But if you are on JobKeeper payments or eligible JobKeeper payments and your employer is an eligible business, then they can issue with reasonable directions or requests like I discussed before. So they can't make it conditional, but it might be that after you're on those JobKeeper payments, they make some changes to your employment temporarily.
Yeah. Okay. Great. And we've also got, I think, the last question here from Lucy, and I'm not actually sure if she means JobKeeper or JobSeeker here, but she said, for a sole trader on JobKeeper, will we need to declare a monthly turnover? Do we know what that process will look like yet?
I see. So it can get quite complicated. It is really a matter for the employer, or in this case, a sole trader and the tax office. There are some really handy guides for sole traders on the ATO's website. So if you look up ATO JobKeeper sole trader guide, there's step-by-step guide on how to apply. You do have to make a declaration each month, but my understanding is that they only make an assessment of the downturn as a once-off, but there are reporting obligations. Not a tax lawyer or an accountant, so I wouldn't want to give too much advice on that, but certainly recommend you have a look at the website. There's some great information up there.
Great. Okay, I think we've got through all the questions. Just having a quick skim to check. Yeah, it looks to me like we've gone through everything. So hopefully that was helpful to everyone. Thank you so much, Beth, for all your expertise on employment law and JobKeeper and what people can expect in what's a really uncertain time for everybody. As we said at the beginning, so I work for Canberra Community Law and Beth works for the Women's Legal Centre. And we and our teams, can provide individual advice. So today's just been about legal information, but if things still aren't clear to you or you're having issues with in the workplace or with Centrelink, then please give us a call. I can see that Canberra Community Law has been posting the ways in which that you can do that. So Women's Legal Centre, obviously that's for women's only. So we've also posted the help line for Legal Aid ACT, which can also give you employment law and JobKeeper advice if you need it. Is there anything that you want to add, Beth?
Could I sneak in a question that a few of my clients have asked for you, Sophie?
Oh, yeah, put me on the spot.
This is about, I've had a few clients who are in the process of applying for the DSP, so the Disability Support Pension, and that can be quite complicated. And now that JobSeeker is available, they've figured, I'm just going to apply for JobSeeker because it's so much more simple. But will that affect their ability to claim the DSP in the future?
Yeah. So there are some issues with this. If someone hasn't, so if you're just considering what payment is best for you, there's no problem with you applying for the JobSeeker payment. If you are already on the disability support pension, I would, there are huge risks with you transferring to the JobSeeker payment. So you would need to give a lot of thought to that. And if you're in the process of applying for the DSP, I think some of those same risks apply. So basically, to be put on the disability support pension, it's a really high threshold. You have to prove that you have a permanent, stable, fully treated disability. That means that you can't work above a certain threshold. When you're on the JobSeeker payment, you're effectively saying that you're looking for work, and you have to fulfill a bunch of mutual obligations. So I guess the risks are twofold. One is that when you're on the JobSeeker payment, if you can't fulfill those mutual obligations, for example, because of your disability, you're then potentially going to get penalised and get cut off your JobSeeker payment. Now, those mutual obligations have been suspended until the 22nd of May, but there's no guarantee that they're going to stay suspended. So that's obviously really risky for people. The other problem is if you hop off the DSP and get onto the JobSeeker payment, there may be a question that arises in the Centrelink assessing officers about whether or not they really think you are eligible for the DSP. Now, I think, Beth, the reason why this question is arising is because the coronavirus supplement, so that extra $550 that we talked about, that isn't getting attached to the DSP. It's only getting attached to certain payments like the JobSeeker payment. And so people on the disability support pension are actually, getting comparatively a bit less than what you would be getting on the JobSeeker payment. And there isn't really a clear explanation for this. And certainly a lot of social security and social justice organisations have been campaigning for this to change. But my advice would be that you need to proceed with caution. If you haven't applied for anything yet, I think that's much safer. But if you are on the disability support pension or you're in the process of applying, at the moment, that payment is the only sort of secure long-term payment that's going to stay at that rate when we're through this crisis. Whereas so far, Scott Morrison and others in the government are saying that the JobSeeker payment is going to go back to the old rate. So that's back to the really low rate of about $40 a day for many people. So my advice would be to be really careful. And if you can't work it out or if you need some extra help, then definitely seek some legal advice before making any big changes.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really useful.
No worries. All right. Well, we've been going for 45 minutes, so I think we'll leave it there. We will do our best to keep monitoring the comments on the Facebook page early next week. So if you do put a comment there, we'll do our best to reply to you and give you some links to wherever you need to go to get further information. If you have any ideas about more Q&As that you'd like us to run or more information that you think would be useful to you or your friends or family, please also post those ideas in the comments. We're really keen during this time to be getting people the information they need to make things less stressful and also so that you can make the best decisions possible in these extremely weird, stressful times. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Beth. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks very much, Sophie. Thanks, everyone, for watching.
Bye.